Well, happy Monday morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here, and thank you as always for being with me for today's devotion, whether you're watching the video or listening to the podcast. I appreciate it very, very much and hope it's a great blessing to you. Today we are in 1 Corinthians 6, and as we're getting started, just want to share with you, starting a new journal today. This is my 10th journal since we started doing D groups. I had my first journal when I piloted groups in 2019, and so today I'm starting in my 10th journal, and mine are all this size or a little bigger. And it's kind of neat to kind of look back and especially at some of the chapters that we've read previously and see what God spoke to me, say 2 years ago in a chapter compared to what He speaks to me today in a chapter. What verse, what word, what phrase, whatever jumps out at me. And I'd say 70-80% of the time is something different. Well, 1 Corinthians 6, Paul, he's writing this letter to a church he started that has just a lot of issues. And he's already dealt with divisiveness over who their favorite pastor, et cetera, was. And then the member who was sleeping with his stepmom that they weren't doing anything about. And in this chapter, he deals with two additional issues. One is lawsuits, members suing one another in court. And then secondly, sexual immorality, especially prostitution. And we'll explain that in a moment. All right, let's talk about the lawsuits first. He deals with that in the first 11 verses, and he encourages them to settle their disputes among themselves internally rather than going to secular court. That's the preferred method. He even goes so far as to talk about finding a mediator within the church. Let's look at verses 5, 6, and 7, where he says, I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not among you one wise man who will be able to decide between his brethren? Brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. Actually, then, it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? So there's a lot in that. He's saying, when you sue each other in court, you're fellow believers, you're in the church, you're suing each other in court, it's a horrible witness, terrible testimony. You've already lost because you should care more about your testimony than that. He said, settle this between yourselves. And if you need an arbitrator, find someone you both trust and will submit to in the church and let them be the arbitrator between you. Because you're being a terrible witness. But he goes on to say, and by the way, you wouldn't have this problem if you would stop defrauding one another. You would not have this problem if you would have integrity in your dealings and stop taking advantage of another brother or sister. Just to have some integrity among yourselves, and there'll be no reason for lawsuits. Now, there's the old adage: don't go into business with a good friend, or don't go into business with a family member. There's actually some wisdom in that, because sometimes it's not just about defrauding; it's about just real strong differences of opinion. So you need to be very careful. But then he says sometimes it's worth it just to lose. To lose. In other words, don't destroy your testimony or the witness of Christ over a few bucks. These are principles that we have to all apply to our lives. And I'm not talking about if somebody has sexually abused someone or if someone swindled you out of $100,000, but there's a lot of things that sometimes we just need to let go, even if it costs us a little bit. We ought to be able to settle things among ourselves. We ought to submit to the authority of wise people in the church. And we ought to live and act in such a way we don't have to worry about lawsuits anyway. So that's what he's saying here. Now, the second issue, starting at verse 12, is immorality, sexual sins, prostitution. And he uses the word immorality in verse 13, which is the Greek word porneia, that refers to sexual sins of all kinds. We sort of get our word pornography from it, but it would refer to any sexual sin you can think of. That outside of a sexual relationship between a husband and wife, a man and a woman who are committed to each other in marriage, any other form of sex, heterosexual, homosexual, doesn't matter, any form of sex outside of a husband and wife in marriage is porneia, immorality, contrary to God's design, and therefore it is sinful. And he goes on to say here that when you sin sexually, you sin with your body, because the biblical teaching is that when people are together sexually, the two bodies, they become one flesh. Well, you can get that image. And that we are one flesh with our spouse, going all the way back to Genesis 1. He also says you are, in a very real sense, your body belongs to God, because you gave yourself to God. And when you give yourself to Jesus, you give everything, all of you, which includes your body. And your body is now the temple of God, because the Holy Spirit lives within you. So God is in you, making your body a temple in a very real sense. So your body is the temple of God. Your body belongs to God. And if you're married as a man or a woman to a man or a woman, you're married, you're one flesh with that person. And so he says, when you commit sexual sins, porneia, immorality, sex of any kind outside of a man and a woman bound together in one flesh as husband and wife in marriage, any sex other than that, you are taking your body that belongs to your spouse, your body that belongs to God, and you are misusing it. You are sinning. So he uses the example when you are with a prostitute, which would have been very common in Corinth, especially with what we call sacred prostitutes, sleeping with prostitutes at the temple was a form of worship. And sexual immorality was very common in their culture. He said, anytime you do that, you are taking your body that belongs to God, your body that is one flesh with your spouse, and you are joining that with someone else, and that is a sin. That is an abomination. And it's not to be done. So that's what the passage is dealing with. Now, on a personal note, I'm just have to admit that, God slapped me a little bit when I was reading at the beginning of this section, verses 12 and 13, where he says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. There are a lot of things that it may be okay to do morally, but it doesn't mean it's wise to do them. He says, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And talking, in other words, there's things that's okay to do until that stuff becomes something that controls you, an addiction, an overpowering desire, whatever you want to call it. And then here's where he just said, all right, Steve, let me smack you around a little bit, make you think a little bit. Verse 13, food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. God will do away with both of them. God will do away with both of them. And yet the body is not for immorality, the sexual sins, but for the Lord. The Lord. And so, all right, Steve, in heaven, we know from the gospel there's no marriage, okay? We're not married in heaven. And here he's saying, when you're in heaven in that new spiritual body, stomach and food, you don't need to eat. And he says, whatever we can do, and eating is cool, it's good, unless it controls you. And for all of us who are overweight, that's not a fun verse to read. Neither is it a fun verse to read for people who look at pornography, enjoy watching movies that they probably shouldn't watch. Couples living together outside marriage. Husbands and wives cheating on their spouse. Homosexual behavior. Vulgar language, lust. On and on we could go. This verse says, Well, that's an encouraging note to end on, isn't it? But sometimes we have to deal with the hard stuff. Hey, God bless you. And I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 7. God bless you, everybody.